All right, why don't we go ahead and get going? So I'm going to start by saying good morning or afternoon or evening, everyone. I am Miriam Bender. I'm associate professor in the School of Nursing here at University of California, Irvine, and I'm the director of the school's Center for Nursing Philosophy. I welcome you all to this virtual speaker event series in which the center tries to bring the new to nursing in terms of ideas that can help spark novel thinking about our own ideas, practices, and scholarship. We aim for diversity in perspectives and have heard from scholars across multiple disciplines on a wide swath of topics, from nursing and Shakespeare to the decolonization of nursing. Today, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing Frank B. Wilderson III, who is Chancellor's Professor of African American Studies in the department at UC Irvine. During the apartheid era, he spent 5.5 years in South Africa, where he was one of 2 Americans to hold elected office in the African National Congress, and he was a cadre in the underground. His books include Incognito, a memoir of exile and apartheid, which was winner of the American Book Award, the Zora Neale Hurston/Richard Wright Legacy Award, and a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship. He's also written Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, as well as Afropessimism, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. Wilderson was educated at Dartmouth College, Columbia University, and UC Berkeley, where he received his PhD in rhetoric and film studies. He will speak to us today on the first principles of Afropessimism, as well as how these principles can be in conversation with the ethical dilemmas of nursing in particular and healthcare and medicine more broadly. He will be joined by Dr. Dawn Bounds, who is a mental health nurse practitioner and assistant professor right here in the School of Nursing. She received her PhD in nursing as well as her clinical training as a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner from Rush University in Chicago. Her research is focused on the risk and resilience of youth and the prevention of risk behaviors such as substance abuse, mental health symptoms, and sexual exploitation using technology-facilitated family-based interventions. Dr. Bounds is an alumni of the prestigious SAMHSA Minority Fellowship Program and the American Nurses Association McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics Fellowship at the University of Chicago, and an inaugural recipient of the Chancellor's Inclusive Excellence Award here at UCI for 2020-21. Before we begin, I just briefly want to let you know that you can all use the chat box as you like to express any thoughts. But please use the Q&A box to put forth any questions that you would like Frank and or Dawn to address when we get to the Q&A session. And I will be reading them out to them both during this session. With that said, please join me in welcoming Frank for his presentation, Confusing Moral Judgment with Ethical Assessment in Addressing Racial Conflict. Thank you, Frank, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Miriam. And as I said before, when we were off screen, good to meet you. I'm looking forward to our conversation. And thank you all in the virtual audience for being here. As you probably know from reading the announcement on the website, there's a quote there from me, and it goes like this: "It is common for Anglo-Americans to confuse moral judgment and ethical assessment. We often use the terms interchangeably as though they mean the same thing, when in point of fact, we are really speaking of the former, moral judgment. We lack the vocabulary or the training to comprehend, much less deploy, a lens of interpretation predicated on ethical dilemmas. The implications for this confusion have debilitating impacts on the way racial conflicts in general and anti-Black antagonisms in particular are addressed in all contexts, including health contexts. A violence of optimism clouds our vision and feeds the frustration of Black people writ large." So I want to start basically with a kind of anecdotal intervention from my new book, Afropessimism, which is, in terms of a genre, it's called auto theory, in which storytelling is interspersed and spliced with critical theory. Uh, and I don't want the beginning to be too bogged down in the theory. I want later for Dawn and others to help me flesh out some of the questions that are theoretically still lingering. But I do want to say that Afropessimism is often confused with what was called Afropessimism in the 1980s, which was a conservative sociological area studies field of investigation that was underwritten by the idea that the governments of Africa were so corrupt and that African people were so inept that there could never be any hope for wide-scale governmental democracy on the African continent, or the type of liberal civil society that we have, or that we're supposed to have. I don't believe that myself, that many people believe we have in the United States of America. Now, that is an Afro-pessimism, which is a mode of investigation by right-wing journalists, Heritage Foundation type people, and what's called area studies scholars that was developed in the late 70s and the 1980s, and really intellectually fueled the agenda of people like Chester Crocker, who was Assistant Secretary of State at the State Department and had all kinds of incursions into Angola and supported the South Africans. The Afro-pessimism that I'm talking about, that has been developed by scholars in critical Black studies and in the humanities, is not connected to that. So I want to make that very clear. This is a pessimism of the intellect. It's a pessimism of the capacity for the master narratives of revolutionary liberation. Let me repeat that. It's a pessimism based upon a pessimism of the capacity for the master narratives of revolutionary liberation to fully apprehend and fully understand and fully explain Black suffering. So you can see that it's unfortunate that these two things get confused, but they're not the same. I want to share my screen for a moment and show you a diagram of what the realm of intervention is, what it looks like schematically, and then go into a bit of storytelling, and then come back to another diagram, and then show a short film clip, and then open it up for discussion. So let me see if I can start sharing my screen here. Okay, so either Dawn or Miriam, if this is not able to be seen, please let me know. I'm just going to continue as though.
We see the divided subjects topography.
Okay, very good. So in the humanities and critical theory that is in conversation with or has as its kind of known or implied foundation with psychoanalysis, we have here an understanding of this would be my adjustment to Sigmund Freud's early topography of the psyche. And the early topography of the psyche has three realms, or we could say three maps, areas on the map of the psyche. One would be preconscious interest, and that would be the part of the brain which is able to communicate between, say, myself and Dawn, myself and Miriam, myself and the rest of the audience. That would be the part of the brain which allows for speech to be understood by others in a language that is based upon the rules of linguistic grammar, making sure that those rules are adhered to, so that my object, subject, predicate, and my articles are not mismatched, out of place. There's a kind of sense of the year, if I'm talking to the year 2021, would obviously come before the year 2022. This would be the realm of rational understanding, what is known as the conscious mind, and the preconscious is kind of like Costco, the warehouse where aspects of the psyche are available to speech. But there's another part of the mind, and that is the unconscious. And the unconscious works through a form of signification, which is called a primary process of signification. And I should go back to the number one. The preconscious works through what's called secondary processes of communication, which is to say that the process of communication makes sure that years are not, time is not misunderstood, is not mishmashed. Nouns are not mishmashed. Cat does not mean dog, but the unconscious uses primary processes of signification, which are not in fee to, not loyal to the rational logic of division that the conscious mind needs to have in order to form communal relations with other people, which is to say that in the unconscious mind, there are all kinds of slips of the tongue. The dream might come into view, where you could be having lunch with the Kaiser in the year 2050. So the preconscious mind is developed in a way that allows us to make sense to other people. The unconscious mind uses language in a kind of beeline to pleasure and a beeline away from pain. And so in the unconscious mind, you have intense identification, desire, tenacious fixation. Now, number three, the third realm down here is called structural or paradigmatic position. And actually in Freud's topography, he would have number three as memory. Why would that be memory? Why would I put structural or paradigmatic position here? Because in psychoanalysis, there's typically a baseline understanding that everybody has a family. Everybody is akin, K-I-N, to someone else. That everyone looks at everyone else and recognizes what's called filial connections, family connections. And what Afropessimism has argued is that since 625 AD, when the Arabs and the Chinese and people, they're not even called Arabs or Chinese, they're developing into their own cultural and political identifications. And Iranians, Iraqis, Moroccan Jews, when all these people began to have a kind of consensus that there was a place that they would one day call Africa. And there were people that had named themselves as Buganda, Igbo, Maasai, Watusi, Kikuyu. But these others would vamp on this place that would be called Africa and call this place Africa and call these people Black in a way to develop an antithesis to who they were becoming. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that for at least 1,300 years, a process has been going on, which has allowed for masses of people in the world to develop as cultural entities, but imbricated in that process in which they have developed as cultural entities has been the necessary destruction of the capacity for Black people to be recognized as family, filial, and cultural entities. And so what I'm trying to say here, what Afropessimism is trying to say, is that we need to step back and have a more robust analysis of the different sentient beings on the world, because the world in realm number two here, in the collective unconscious of the world, not in the liberal number one, preconscious of the world, but in the collective unconscious of the world, there's been a 1,300-year maafa, which is to say, it's a Swahili word for chaos, disaster, Holocaust, a 1,300-year maafa, which has taken Black bodies out of the realm of relational beings in the psyche of everyone else and placed them into the realm of social death, people who are structurally dead and whose bodies are available to the whims of others. And so what I'm arguing here, this is an argument based upon a groundbreaking book called Slavery and Social Death by Orlando Patterson, is that Freud's assumption, the assumption of psychology and psychiatry and psychoanalysis writ large, that everyone is a filial being, and by extension, everyone is an affilial being, a member of civil society, affiliation, and a member of a family, filial, needs to be put into question, because even if I, Frank, think of myself as a father, as a grandfather, and as a son, which I certainly do on an uncensored, unconscious daily basis, the world does not see me as that. The world sees me as a speaking implement. And so to assume that everyone who walks into the psychoanalytic office has gone through life recognized as a person who is related to the so-called human family is a faulty assumption. Afropessimism interrogates number 3 to suggest that for everyone else in the world to imagine themselves as filial beings, as members of the human community, there has to be someone in our midst, someone in their midst, who is always already the slave. All right, so with that, I'd like to share an excerpt and from Afropessimism. That is a thumbnail sketch of a highly complicated argument that many people have made based upon the fortification and extension, and sometimes distending the calculus of the work of people like Frantz Fanon, Orlando Patterson, and Hortense Spillers and others. But this is, since we're in a health and healing community here, I thought I'd read a section from an anecdote vignette from the year 2000, when I was a 44, something like that, year old graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, and had to seek psychiatric care. It's called For Halloween, I Washed My Face. A psychotic episode is no picnic, especially if you know you can't call it madness, because madness assumes a change in the weather, a season of sanity. I was moaning, sobbing. The crisp, disposable sheet that lined the gurney rasped as I shifted. I sat up when they came into the room. No one was going to strap me down. But I didn't climb down for fear of giving them cause. In the glare of fluorescence, they, the doctor and the nurse, were white as dust. The gurney rattled as I shook and cried. They did not approach. They didn't call for help, not for themselves, not for me, a monstrous aphasia, too black for care. That's how I saw them see me, and my urge to save them from me eclipsed my desire to be cured. But I couldn't speak, not even to tell them that I wanted to protect them from me. The cluster bomb spiked in my heart. I clutched my chest and cried out. Did they take a step back? Is it your heart? The doctor asked. I wanted to laugh. The funny thing about a mouth is that it needs to close as well as open if a word is to be made. Mine wouldn't close. If it closed, I knew it wouldn't open. The hinges of my jaw made moans or howls, but not words. I thought, how funny is that? I answered him in the words of a bird as its throat is slit. You keep clutching your chest, the doctor said. Are you having a sharp pain somewhere in the region of your heart? I nodded my head. Tell me more, he said, but I felt my lips twisting grotesquely. I didn't want to start sobbing again. He told me to take my time. The nurse nodded gravely as though she were peering at a pug-nosed puppy in a cage. I had the urge to answer her gaze with a pug-nosed puppy bark. As this urge grew, her sadness deepened. My bark and her sad, saucer eyes were headed for a collision. Ruff, ruff, give me a biscuit. My head was spinning and sore in my sides, but not in the same register of emotion. Sir Belly Laugh rose up my torso and met Mr. Why the fuck am I alive, who had fallen through my raging skull and landed in my throat. The sadness drained from the nurse's eyes. She was her frightened self again. The puppy love had morphed into her need for self-preservation from this hulking black mass with matted, uncombed hair and orbs of fireworks bursting from holes where the eyes should be. The doctor sat on a stool with one foot on the lower rung, one foot on the floor. But the nurse remained standing. He massaged a luxuriant eyebrow with his index finger and waited. Laughter is good, he said. Why don't you tell us what's so funny? I wanted to say, would it be all right if I barked? I realized, however, that I would seem crazier if I asked his permission to bark than if I showed some initiative and simply barked without making a big deal of it. I fell through the chasm of laughter and tears. No one had taken me to the student health center. I got there on my own. As I sat on the gurney, sobbing, fearing the fear of the world in the doctor's and nurse's eyes, I could only answer one of their questions. Is someone with you? By shaking my head. How did you get here? Who brought you? Tears scarred my face in reply. Did you drive? One of them said. I shook my head. They noticed car keys in my hand. They still hadn't taken my pulse, or the doctor told me to rest. He said they would return momentarily. When they left, the fluorescent lights pierced my eyes like daggers of ice that hung from mansions in the winters of my childhood. I didn't trust my sense of balance enough to slide off the gurney and turn off the lights. I had no wish to lie face down with only this crinkling disposable sheet between the front of my body and a cold mattress, which rebuked me like a dry cough when I moved. So I remained on my back. Roses exploded as my eyelids closed against the glare. I had been shaving this morning. Had I been shaving this morning when I snapped? I wore a beard, so no, I had not been shaving. But I knew it had started in the mirror. I was washing my face when a stanza of poetry came to me. It started with a sensation of heat on my face and tightness in my chest. The way I often felt as a child on those mornings when I couldn't face the taunting day at a white grammar school set back from the dappled waters of a long lake spotted with willow trees. My flesh hummed as though my shirt were made of insects, and the skin on my back shifted as it did when my mother closed the door behind me each morning. The memory of that frightened little boy who had answered to my name groaned in my ears like the echo of oarlocks on a calm, deserted sea. I pulled the oars for the shore where every grief of my childhood waited. I'm a middle-aged graduate student. I told that image in the mirror. I told the image that the mirror had ruined. I have got it together. But the jag of pain in my chest wouldn't listen. It wanted to remember and hear that poem again, a moment ago, that had flown in and out of my mind. I knew that I had to get out before I died all alone of a heart attack in my bathroom. Walking seemed to make me want to faint. The apartment was small, just a bathroom, then a bedroom, a kitchen, and a living room. In each room, I found something for my hand to hold: the closet door, the stove, the back of a kitchen chair, the rows of living room bookshelves that ended at the front door. The front door closed behind me. I was overcome with vertigo as I looked down those 7 steps as though I were looking into a deep ravine. The urge to faint and the urge to vomit went to blows in my body. Bad karma, I thought, through wet, blurry eyes. I thought I would pass out. My Honda Civic dozed at the curb like a small blue lizard. My keys scratched the wrought iron railing as I stumbled down. We're going trick-or-treating, I thought with a laugh. We've washed our face and we're wearing our school clothes. A beast with insane rage struggled to burst through my skin in a shower of blood and bile. I wanted to cry. One palm pressed against the window. One set of fingers fumbled with the keys. Help me, somebody. I sobbed into my neck, hoping no white person would hear. Please, somebody help me. Now, lying on the gurney, I recalled the threads of silver puke spooling onto the hood of my car. Then, without knowing how or why, I was on a bus in downtown Berkeley. I saw myself seeing myself through the eyes of passengers on the bus as I slumped to one side and softly sobbed. Make them feel safe, I had thought to myself, even though I had never felt more at risk. I would think it again when the nurse and the doctor came into this white sepulcher where I lay. Make them feel safe. The cardinal rule of Negro diplomacy. Now, alone in the clinic, trombones of light blistered my eyes and the room grew cold. The doctor and the nurse at the UC Berkeley Clinic pressed me for answers. How did I get to the clinic? And if they released me, how would I get home? They peered at my car keys and the car keys in my hand as though it were a dangerous weapon in the hands of a child. I shook my head and told them I had taken the bus. Now the pain was not only in my heart, but also in my rib cage and my arms. If the antagonism, I thought, was not between the haves and the have-nots, as Marx had claimed, not between the man and the woman, or the gay and the straight, as I had learned in my graduate seminar on psychoanalysis, but if the essential antagonism was instead between the blacks and all others, then to free the world was to free the world of me. And then the poem came from the morning in the mirror. For Halloween, I washed my face and wore my school clothes, went door to door as a nightmare. When I left my apartment to come there, I looked down the 7 steps from my door to the street as though I was staring into a ravine. I thought I would pass out. My Honda Civic dozed at the curb like a blue sleeping lizard. My keys had scratched the wrought iron railing as I stumbled down the steps. Threads of silver saliva spooled on the car. Somebody help me, I had groaned, but I didn't want my neighbors to see me like this, let alone come to my aid. My neighbors in Berkeley, like my neighbors in Kenwood, where I had grown up in Minneapolis, were white. It would take 10 reincarnations to free me from their debt. You don't want to owe them, I thought. Something deep within me had said, but how could I explain all of that to this doctor and this nurse? I told the truth, that I took the bus, but I didn't tell them why. I remembered to make them feel safe. They sent me home from the UC Berkeley Clinic with pills, SSRIs, which sound like a branch of the military when in point of fact it stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, uppers for depression, and chlorodiazepoxide, which I was pleased to hear was not a rare form of leprosy, but a pill for panic attacks. We normally don't prescribe antidepressants and anti-panic attack drugs together, the doctor confessed, as though gilding his conscience by being upfront with me. For several weeks after I left the clinic, I sought Black therapists, thinking they could help me best. They were no saner than me, which is not to say that, like me, they were falling apart. For the most part, These therapists reminded me of my parents, who were both psychologists, sharp as tic-tac-toe. They cared like none of the white therapists I had sampled cared, with that a mind is a terrible thing to waste kind of care. Without realizing it, we worked hard together in order to help me solve the problems I wasn't having, to lead me from the gully of despair and to keep me from going crazy again. But I had not gone crazy. Many people go crazy, and many of them are not healed, but none of them are Black. One can go crazy only if one has been sane. The time of sanity is not a temporality that the slave has ever known. To a fleeting eye, their madness, these Black psychologists, looks like mine. Excuse me, the others' madness looks like mine, non-Blacks. They go crazy from pressures of racism, sexism, homophobia, and colonial rule. The external forces of aggression become too much for them, and they too find themselves being gaped at on a gurney. But their non-Black tensions are bundled in the question, how does it feel to have a problem? My tensions and those of the Black therapists who tried to heal me are bundled in the question, how does it feel to be a problem? Which is very different than how does it feel to have a problem. There's no analogy between having and being. Every story of despair has a 3-point progression: equilibrium, the status of the mind free of psychic trauma; disequilibrium, the intrusion of a wounding trauma, which indeed all but destroys equilibrium; and finally, equilibrium restored, renewed, or reimagined. The therapeutic cure in psychology, or the end of analysis in psychoanalysis. But if one's mind has never known the first point on that progression, if one's mind has never known equilibrium, if madness, even low grade and as yet unexpressed madness, is your status quo, then time stands still, for you cannot possess your own image as your ego ideal. You cannot love yourself as Black, but are made to hate yourself as white. And it is the word made that throws a wrench in the works of the recovery process. For your self-hatred is the product not of your personal neurosis, but of a violence so vast it birthed your other. It birthed the human being. If the talking cure is a cure for humans, what is the cure for Black people? If you are not the subject of your own redemption, you are, as Cecilia M. Cooper explains, a vector through which others can accomplish themselves. You marry white, it doesn't change. You change your slave name. You turn your white Jesus to the wall, it doesn't change. You marry Black, it still doesn't change. For it to stop, it would have to have started. You go through life not knowing your desire from theirs. Like a man being lynched and forced to eat his severed penis while telling the lynchers lording over him how good it tastes, you see yourself as a phobic object in need of your own self-destruction for someone else's safety. That someone is you, but also not you. What do you do with an unconscious that appears to hate you? After reading David Marriott's On Black Men, the word appears crushed my skull like an elephant's foot. Some days the weight kept me from getting out of bed. On one such day, I was slumped on the floor beside my bed. My first class had already started. But that word appears had its foot on my neck. Did it mean that my unconscious hates me every time it comes into view? That to glimpse my unconscious is to glimpse the desire for my own destruction? Or did it appears suggest doubt, as though my unconscious only seemed to hate me? The quandary made it hard for me to move my body, to rise from the floor and get dressed for my seminar. For if self-hatred was a constitutive element of my Black unconscious, then the talking cure of psychoanalysis and most certainly of therapy was no more than high-grade snake oil. The Black was a static imago of abjection, but this stasis was productive for the human. Against Black abjection, humans could know themselves as agents of change as well as agents who could change. The Marxist that I was at that time in the year 2000, as that Marxist back then, I told myself at the time, I can't believe this. I cannot let myself believe this. But for several months into the 21st century, a Sacramento lawyer who co-authored Proposition 21 let me know that I was wrong. I woke up in the morning with that phone call on my mind. I had been doing political organizing in the San Francisco Bay Area to persuade people to vote against Proposition 21. I had called a lawyer in Sacramento who was a member of the inner circle of lawyers at the state capitol who had authorized Proposition 21, a proposition under which many children as young as 14 years of age would be charged with committing felonies, would no longer be eligible for juvenile court, and the prosecutors would be allowed to directly file charges against juvenile offenders into adult court without having to get permission from the juvenile court. I could not believe any rational person would want to send a child to a place like San Quentin. A lawyer, I thought, had to be a rational person. So when I called this lawyer, I pretended to be a journalist from a right-wing magazine to get into this lawyer's good graces. And I also pretended to be white. And I said to him, this law is not a problem for most people in California, but for the touchy-feely liberals in the San Francisco Bay, they will say that the guidelines for sending children to adult court and then to San Quentin or Folsom are just veiled strategies for instructing prosecutors and judges on how to weed Black kids from those who are not Black. The silence at the end of the line was too much for me. For a moment, I thought he knew that I was in disguise, which would put him 2 steps ahead of me. But when he spoke, he asked me if I had any children. In other words, we were still speaking white to white. So the game wasn't open. We were, in fact, talking white to white. I told him my daughter's 13, without also saying that she's a beautiful South African girl with glowing onyx skin, almond eyes, and a hint of mischief in her smile. I have 2 boys, the lawyer who was authoring this proposition said. He then said that he and I both knew something. I started to sweat. I didn't know what he and I knew. He said, we know that our children are not those children. Those children, he said to me, are animals. We are, he informed me, categorically not sending 14-year-old children to San Quentin. We're sending animals to San Quentin. I was so dazed that when he said, it was a pleasure to speak with you, Mr. Wall Jasper, the reporter I had pretended to be, I didn't know whom he meant. A new century had begun. It was the year 2000, but nothing essential had changed. I sat on the floor of my Berkeley apartment with no will to move. So, without much preamble, I do have some other diagrams, but I'd rather us get into some conversation and hear your response to my opening remarks with the my adjustments to Freud's topography, what I just read, and then maybe I could work the other diagrams into our back and forth. But I want to leave you with a clip of another professor at a Northern California college, because what I just read to you and this other clip are symptomatic or episodic expressions of what it means to live in a realm where one cannot be seen in the collective unconscious as anything other than a speaking implement. One cannot be seen as anything other than a socially dead slave. This is a film that my wife Anita Wilkins and I made in 2005. And what I'd done is I went around to intellectuals and Black people, some who were houseless, some were students, and I just asked them, what does slavery mean to you in the year 2004? And I was very distressed to begin with the responses, because what I found was that each interview was about 2 hours, was that the question seemed to strike such a painful nerve that the speech patterns moved unconsciously away from addressing it. And I thought at some point people were evading my question. When I went back and looked at the footage, I realized that they were answering the question symptomatically and saying exactly that even though chattel no longer existed, the sense of captivity, the sense of being a object available for the whims of others and not having a reality that others can empathize with, still existed in their own ways, which were different experientially, but were the same structurally. This a college instructor, Wanda Sabir, will mention a word called the maafa. And for those of you who do not know this, maafa is a Swahili word. It means great disaster or great tragedy. And it's a term that refers to the centuries-long enslavement and murder of millions of Africans by Arabs and Europeans, the maafa. So let's go to this, and then we'll go to some conversation. Let me see if I can bring this up.
For all that work.
I'm feeling isolated. I'm feeling alone. I'm feeling no support. But first, I didn't even have a name for the anxiety attacks. I thought I was having a heart attack. And this academic job will kill you. Look at Black folks. And we're the only one. Look at those poor people that were integrated in all those schools. They have trouble. They have problems. We want to make you homogenize. And maybe because you can't homogenize me, I'm having more difficulty than other people. My presence is a statement. And it's like, who wants to associate with somebody like me? It would mess up their tenure. It would mess up their benefits because it's not popular to be Black in America. I thought, well, now I'm tenure track and I've got a home. I thought I had a home. I did, feel dedicated to my students. I had integrity around my position and my job, even if others didn't believe in me. But last year, when I'm like jumping in, like, okay, I'm like, what am I, a company woman? I should have, that never works for Black people. Alameda is in a real provincial kind of environment, real small, closed community that I did not know was like it is. It's not just a small, closed community insofar as people who live here. It's a small, closed community that leaks into the institution. So I'm putting on this program, for the Ma'afa. And I'm thinking, okay, the Ma'afa is for Black people. It's for us to remember what happened to our ancestors and give our ancestors a funeral. And white people are not invited to the ritual. And we don't care if they come to anything else, but they can. But we don't care. So it's like, ooh. And I'm like, I have literature that says Black people only on it. And so I'm sharing that with my colleagues here at the College of Alameda, and they are not happy. One colleague threw it at me. It didn't hit the desk, it went on the floor. I'm like, no, I'm not giving this to my students. It's like, whoa. We had events. The only one they couldn't come to was the rich people. We were my ancestors and we're giving them a funeral, a sunrise ceremony, and that's the only thing they couldn't come to. Because if they came, I would have told them to get the heck off the beach. Even though I don't own the beach, I own it in that morning. I own that space. And these are my ancestors, and I was like, say goodbye. So I told them, don't come, because you might have your feelings hurt, because I'm going to tell you later. We had to ride up in the Laney College Tower to explain the Ma'afa. But, you know, things were never the same after that. I was surprised and shocked. And he wasn't the only one. He was the only one that threw it at me. But other people looked at me weird. And then you think you have an ally in a non-African person, and you don't. You know, we got any disagreements, we talk about it somewhere else. You don't diss me in the forum. We're always together. You always have my back. I always have your back. That's Black folks do that, you know, because we're in a guerrilla war, you know, and we're soldiers. That's what my father taught me, and we never break rank, never. So anyway, yeah, kind of feeling this. Oh man, I'm getting sad. Maybe that's what kills is the hostility. Hostility is something you can measure. Within my department, I have to be really careful. Within the all college community, I don't say anything anymore. I make myself an invisible person. You know, like the spook who sat by the door, only I'm not a spook, or invisible man, although I'm not invisible because I'm just too visible, but I can keep my mouth shut. But meanwhile, my stomach's hurting. You know, right now as I remember this, my stomach's hurting and I'm having an anxiety attack.
Okay, one of the, I see that I have a few more minutes. So one of the kind of interventions against Afropessimism comes from a Marxist line. And I want to say that having been deeply schooled in Marxism and at UC Berkeley, I've often taught the first 500 pages of Das Kapital. So I am a dedicated anti-capitalist, and I think that Marx's analysis of he would call it the antagonism between the workers and the bourgeoisie or the bosses is an antagonism. I would call it a conflict. And there's an intervention against Afropessimism that says that the logic of it doesn't necessarily work for people in different classes. And I want to share an anecdote with you of one more interview, because a woman from the opposite end of the spectrum from Wanda Sabir, this is a woman who basically at the time was living in shelters or on the street, because what I'm seeing in their extended interviews and the short clip that I used, and in my own example, is that experientially, the lived experience of social death and anti-Black antagonism is going to have a different performative aspect depending upon what realm you're in. But there is a common structure of the inability to be recognized and incorporated by the collective unconscious into what's called the human fold. So I'll do this short clip here, and then we'll talk. Let's see here. 1 second.
Since we hand carried those and slush another.
Okay, I've got it.
We're not seeing your screen yet, though.
Thank you. How are we doing now? Are we seeing it?
Yes.
Okay, very good. And the audio is good. Okay, let's begin.
The string of no reply.
I just didn't really want to talk to nothing about slavery and stuff. I didn't want kids to know nothing. My mother didn't really tell us nothing about slavery, but you seen it. You seen it. Why don't y'all go back from where you came from? You know, and all this stuff about going back to Africa. I ain't never been to Africa in my life. Then they want us to sit down nowhere and be laughing and stuff about sitting on a milk crate. And these police officers didn't want us to do it. Police officers, I thought they were black, but they wasn't. They said they're not black. They was from some other little country or something. And the chief of police said that they weren't even supposed to be up here. The ones on these bicycles, they wasn't even supposed to be up here doing that to us. Man, it hurt because I thought the police would help us, but they didn't. A lot of this stuff is sin is believing. And she way down the street, and I'm hollering to tell her that her car's there. And she looking at me like, I'm asking, says your name Laura? I'm asking her, and she's just looking at me because I'm black. She's just looking at me. And then I walked up to her, I said, your name Laura? I said, here, you left your card up there in the bank. And then she said, thank you, and smiling and grinning, and that was it. She could at least gave me $1 or something. Sure. She got ready to go, she got in her car. It was a brand new car. This woman had it, wouldn't give me $1. Things that they say up here to you. Look at you, like you're doing now. They just hate blacks. I mean, they do. They all hate black people. I don't know why we such a hated race. And then the blacks is getting jobs now. They done got us all off welfare, and they giving it to the people with the kids with the blonde hair and the blue eyes. And some kind of look. You have to see this. I mean, I know most of you blacks seen this look. How these white people look at you, that hate look. And then what gets me, this hatred is still here. It's still here. All these years, and they still hate. As I get older, I'm just getting tired. Real tired. This hatred, I mean, just same thing. I mean, the same hate. Just hate black people. And why we are so hated. You try to tell people how this is, they really don't believe it.
Okay, so in closing,
My sister and I were the only blacks
sorry.
in our neighborhood.
Sorry. Let's see here. All right. So in closing, let me just say that what's underwriting all of this is a concept of violence that Afropessimism has elaborated and challenges the notion of violence that has normally been theorized for oppressed people. We would argue that the violence of the slave estate cannot be thought of in the way that one thinks of the violence of capitalist oppression or in patriarchal oppression of non-Black women. The violence of anti-Blackness it takes an ocean of violence to produce a slave, singular or plural, but that violence never goes into remission. The violence of social death is actually subtended by the production of psychic health for all those who are not Black, something that cannot be literally commodified or weighted on an actual balance sheet. That's the more intangible libidinal aspect of anti-Black violence. In other words, activists want to make sense of the death of Sandra Bland and the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. When these spectacles require, in order to be adequately explained, what they require is a theory of nonsense, their absence of a tangible or rational utility. Black people are not murdered for transgressions such as illegal immigration or workplace agitation. The essential utility of anti-Black violence and Black death is paradoxically the absence of utility. Black death does have a certain utility, but it is not subtended, as Marx would say, by the extraction of surplus value, not in any fundamental way. And it is certainly not subtended, as the case with Native Americans, in the usurpation of land. Black death is subtended, which is to say, necessary to the psychic integration of everyone who is not Black. Black death functions as national therapy, even though the rhetoric that explains and laments these deaths expresses this psychic dependence, not directly, but symptomatically. It is complex, but it is simple too. Black people are not going to be genocided like Native Americans. We are being genocided, but genocided and regenerated, because the spectacle of Black death is essential to the mental health of the world. We cannot be wiped out completely because our deaths must be repeated visually. Bodily mutilation of Blackness is necessary, so it must be repeated. What we are witnessing on YouTube, Instagram, and the nightly news as murders are rituals of healing for civil society, rituals that stabilize and ease the anxiety that other people feel in their daily lives. It's the anxiety that people have walking around. It can be stabilized by lots of different things: marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, affairs. But the ultimate stabilization of this anxiety is the spectacle of violence against Black people. I know I am human because I am not Black. I know I am not Black because when and if I experience the kind of violence and aggressivity that Black people experience, there would have to be a reason, some contingent form of transgression. Thank you. So we can open it up. Dawn and Miriam.
Thank you, Frank. That.
I have to admit that I'm full of emotion. Thank you for sharing. And I have 2 pages of notes, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time here. So I will try to pick and choose as I continue to wrap my mind around what you've shared today. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and so perhaps this will help me pick and choose what I might begin to attempt to initiate a dialogue on. I was hoping to start with your mention of the 1,300 years of chaos, this collective consciousness that's been built over time, because Deshawn does mention the Willie Lynch letters and some of the psychological intentions that for many of us.
Just froze. I'll wait.
So, and also for different purposes, which is what's really interesting. Go for it.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, Dawn. You said Deshawn and many of us, and then you froze, and then you came back in with for different purposes. So there was a whole lot in between that I mean, I'm a fiction writer, so I can make it up, but I don't want to do that.
Sorry about that. The fun of Zoom, I guess. What I was referring to was the mention of the 1,300 years of collective consciousness that's been built that you've mentioned. And one of the Q&As in the chat is from Deshawn, who referred to the Willie Lynch letters and the mention of 300 years of psychological intentional enslavement. And so one of my thoughts was discussing a little bit further about reconciling that and the history of the Willie Lynch letters in terms of the psychological enslavement of slaves. I think is different from what you're speaking of in terms of the purposes of enslavement or social death, as you referred to it. And so I just wanted to touch on that question and kind of reconcile the impact of 300 years versus 1300 years and a little bit further on the purpose. I think you concluded quite beautifully on what the purpose is. It's quite distressing to think about that you said freedom for the world is to free the world from me. And so as a Black person, that's very distressing to consider when we think of solutions. However, the fact that this is serving a purpose means, as you began, that we have to go back much further. So I was hoping you can elaborate a little bit further on what that means.
Yeah, Don, maybe you could help me because as my daughter used to say, Daddy, you talk more shit than a radio. Uh, so that I don't do that, since we only got half an hour, can you hone me in on one little point that I could address? Because I'm also emotionally kind of discombobulated. So
Yeah.
Can you help me?
Sure.
Because I would start talking to find my way, and I don't want to do that.
So we are an audience of nurses and philosophers, and so I know as myself as a nurse, I immediately go to solution. And so you mentioned 1300 years of chaos and the need to go back further, much further than the 300 and 400 years that I believe is perhaps the narrative of Black people in America. I think we reference oftentimes the Willie Lynch letters and the psychological implications of that only over 300, 400 years. And you actually just put things on an international scale going back 1300 years. And so when you say starting from the beginning, and reconciling our current purpose for the world's mental health, I'm wondering, where do we go from here?
Well, I don't know where we go. I mean, that I would be lying to actually pretend, but I'm also not. I think we have to. One of the things that I have learned by living in other places, and this is why I started off with on your website with the quote about ethics versus morals, is that how we approach things is not autodidactic. I mean, in other words, you don't go to a movie not knowing how to receive the narrative. You have been trained how to do that. And there are many people. One that comes to mind is Matthew Arnold, who in 1869, which is very interesting, made a decision that education in Britain and then ultimately the Anglo-American world of Canada, Australia, et cetera, is going to be based on observation, empiricism, and problem solving. That was a highly political move that helped generalize the foundation of how we look. And so what Afropessimism is trying, one of the things it's trying to do is break that apart, because what it means is that the psyche then accepts the world into which it was born and looks to change aspects of that world to improve it, and never actually takes a kind of, you go through K through 12 asking yourself, how can I live up to the mores of the Constitution? How can I live up to the mores of the Bill of Rights? You don't ask yourself, does the United States have a right to exist? That's an ethical scale. And so, and that infects everything we do, so that it's so that teachers tend not to present problems to students that don't have solutions. And if you look at Matthew Arnold's writing when he was, developing public education in England, that's a very political very political pedagogic imposition on thinking, because he doesn't want the rabble, meaning the working class, to start finding its own solutions, because he's afraid of what's happening in France, okay, that are a revolution. What I am not saying, I mean, both my parents, my mother's passed, but both my parents were psychologists. I saw that they helped people, okay? But what did they help people do? And I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, you know, they helped Black couples, and part of the practice is women coming out of prison, uh, integrate into society and live in a way that kind of dampened the anxiety so that they could move through the day. Now, that's not my project. I'm not saying it's a bad project, because we got to, I start the book and end the book with a 44-year-old grad student who can't get out of bed in the morning. But there's also something generative about not being able to get out of the bed in the morning. And what's generative about it is a mind that is not willing to accept the legitimacy of the world in which he lives. And that is my only like I said, I'll be 66 in a few days. That's my only contribution. I can't actually think how to help people live in the world that exists, because what I ultimately know is that there, having my second book dealt with Red, White, and Black Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms, actually thought this starts with the transatlantic slave trade. And then the more I read, and then having graduate students who are from the Middle East and working on this, I can see, oh no, this actually, there's no such thing as Black. There's no such thing as Africa until the Arabs begin to name their chattel. And they begin the destruction of communal life. And that destruction there's a symbiosis between that destruction and the production of filio accoutrement. In other words, I as an Arab am learning, I as an Iraqi am learning, I as a Chinese am learning, I as an East Indian am learning, as a Moroccan Jew am learning from 625 AD to about 1300 how to be a cultural being. And you don't learn that in isolation. You can't say what a cat is without saying it is not a dog. Everything that is named comes into consciousness through two modes of understanding. One is called, I forget the clinical term, but it's what it is like. Cat is like tiger. It is like lion. It is like leopard. But ultimately, those definitions are not final. The essential definition of what something is can only be solidified by what it is not. And that's a basic way that language works through semiotics. So this notion of who are we as communal beings, both individually in the Arab world, in the Iraqi world, in the Persian world, in the Moroccan Jewish world, who are we is based upon our cultural accoutrement, what language we speak, where we live, how we marry. But at the end of the day, it is finalized by who we are not, and we are not the slave. And what is interesting, and what Afropessimism has actually done, it is shown that this word Black doesn't have a prior cultural life before it was decided that these sentient beings are a chattel. I want to make another move. Is that, I mean, there's a highly controversial move, and it's a very big argument in Black studies worldwide. But let me just ask you, is that part basically clear? Because I want to make another. Okay. So the next move is that way of thinking never went away. It only became disguised in white liberal embarrassment to it. You know, we're the only place where you can find true talk is in prison, is in Hollywood, is south of the Mason-Dixon line, and amongst Afrikaners, non-English speaking white people in South Africa. Everybody else has a veil between their unconscious understanding that I am a relational being and a Black is not, because they're embarrassed by that. But that embarrassment doesn't stop the trauma that someone like Wanda Sabir experiences in an English faculty meeting. And that embarrassment actually gets jettisoned because one does not have to perform a kind of we are the world humanness to Caroline on the street. One can just go to her with the aggressivity of the unconscious and say to her, you are nothing. In the faculty room, one has to wait. It has to come out in shot through a prism, and in ways that white liberals don't even understand, okay? But what I'm trying to say in that video is that both these women experience it in their bodies. And I'm also trying to say that beyond a global revolution, I would argue that there's no way to change who they are in the collective unconscious, that who they are as non-beings is necessary for others to be psychically grounded. And that's, I mean, I elaborated that in great detail in my interrogation of psychoanalysis in my chapter of Red, White, and Black. So just, there is no cure for cancer. I've got it right now. That doesn't mean we don't work on it, but it does mean that we don't pretend that something can cure me, because it keeps coming back. There is no cure for anti-Blackness except the end of the world. I'm sorry. That's where I'm at.
And so the impact on Black people, I wrote down something you repeatedly said, which was to make them feel safe, to
Yes.
protect them from me, to save them from me. And this moment of seeing yourself through the eyes of the passengers on the bus.
Yeah.
And so if we could just shift to Black light and that constant, and there's this other piece that you say that it's never enough. I marry white and it's never enough. We get our PhDs and it's never enough. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, right? Of these attempts that we make. And by your suggestion, it's to save them from us.
Yeah, I mean, if we're really going to just turn down into Dante's Inferno. Now look, I want to be very clear. Afropessimism is not an emotional dispensation. There are a lot of jokes in my book. I want people to buy my book and laugh, okay? I used to be a stand-up comic back in 1978, okay? So it is a pessimism of the intellect. It is a pessimism. I mean, Lacan says, I, Lacan, based upon my correct reading of Freud, can take the analyson into lie him, her, or them on my couch, and ultimately I can cure them of their neurotic manifestations and bring them to a point where in their relations, they give to others their otherness, say in a marriage, and they get back the otherness. In other words, that they're not, they don't suffer from a kind of tenacious fixation where they are projecting all sorts of bad things onto other people or projecting a constant victimization on themselves, that they can see that language is malleable and we can all use language to heal therapeutically and get to a point of transformation. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be worked on. I mean, I've been in psychoanalysis and therapy and all kinds of things ever since 1978. However, I am saying that the collective unconscious and I would argue, based upon the work of David Marriott and Frantz Fanon at his most honest, not the Frantz Fanon who wants something, because there's a Frantz Fanon who wants to heal the rift between him and his wife, as opposed to the Frantz Fanon who accepts that though I love my wife, she's my master and I'm always her slave. That's just too heavy for him. Okay, but the Frantz Fanon who goes to the cul-de-sac, I would, and actually talks about in his chapters, the man of color and the white woman and the woman of color and the white man, talks about lactification, or the clinical term would, for the neurosis would be hallucinatory whitening, that the Black psyche is as anti-Black as the non-Black psyche. It's just that that anti-Blackness in the Black psyche is not a mechanism which heals the Black body. It actually continues to make it painful. And so you're never, one is never alone. There's never you by yourself. In fact, when you're in a room by yourself, that's when you're the most crowded situation ever, okay? I would say going to a football game, you're more isolated than when you're in your bedroom by yourself, because the voices come in and the voices are saying, turn white or disappear, turn white or disappear, turn white or disappear. The voices are saying, and I'm not saying every individual Black person has the voices in the same way or responds, everyone's different. But what I am saying is that you cannot get away from this imperative that I am viewed as the problem, not that I have an agenda like the Jew, which has been construed as a problem. I have an agenda like the Native American, which has been construed as a problem. My corporeal integrity, what I am viewed as, is a bodily contaminant, not an ideational contaminant. And that's a very different kind of way to live, to know that my body contaminates, not that my political agenda contaminates. And if you read the declassified files of the FBI or the Maryland Center for Intelligence from the Maryland State Police that wrote 80 pages on Assata Shakur and the Black Liberation Army, one of the very interesting things is that they're frantic about the fear of Black aggression. But nowhere in these documents can you find a sentence of what would it mean if Black people took over. In other words, they move from a logical understanding that there's a Black threat to a phantasmagorical absence of what that Black threat means. But when they write about Chicanos, when they write about Puerto Ricans, when they write about Native Americans, they're very clear. These people want to cross the border illegally. These people want to take back the United States. The Jews have an international banking system that will destroy our economy. There's no such thing in the collective unconscious as a threat of a Black idea. And yet, the threat of Blackness looms larger in the psyche than anyone else. That is horrifying, it's fascinating, and I would also say it's not outside of me.
Miriam, I know I can talk about this all day, and there are lots of questions popping in, so I will defer to you Q&A.
Well, I did want to acknowledge that there's many comments in the chat box, and we do have a lot of questions, too many to ask and have Frank and you answer in this time period. I will say that there is one theme in numerous questions that speaks back to the title of the talk, which is in terms of morals versus ethics. And Frank, I'm wondering, would you allow me to read a quote of you that you that you said right after the Floyd murder, and in a webinar. That was really profound for me, and I think it speaks to some of the questions. The quote is this, that Frank delivered on June 4th, 2020. Quote, "The thing of guilt and innocence we refuse to accept structures itself and then move us into an economy of ethical assessment. When you move out of an economy of moral judgment, you're moving out of the question of individual guilt and innocence and moving into the question of structural power. And when you move into this question of structural power, you cannot return unless you're just blind to an assessment of the American project and call it unethical on any level. Once you start talking about ethics, it has no ethical value and no ethical reason for its existence. It exists because it has 3 million people in uniform and 150,000 more people under Clinton in the streets as police and the nuclear bomb. That's power and violence, not ethics."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're just not taught to understand, let alone question, the paradigm in which we exist. And part of what keeps us from doing it, and believe me, I'm not saying this is like trivial, is the firepower of the United States against any entity. I mean, when Black people are in the streets raising issues of civil rights, they're treated with state violence as though they're armed insurrectionists. I mean, if you once you decide to actually raise the level of abstraction, then you've got to make up your mind to be like Assata Shakur, who is she's about 73 years old, has 3 bullets in her chest, and lives in Cuba, who was a Panther in the Black Liberation Army. When she went to court for being accused of robbing banks, when she went to court being accused of having shot a trooper, she did not adjudicate her innocence, because that would be the question of morality. She used the opportunity to try the American project. Okay, now some would say that's highly suicidal, but on the other hand, it's the correct thing to do. And I'm not saying that I'm not prescribing that people do this or don't do this. I'm saying think about thought, how you have been taught to think. I was arguing this, and I'm also very alive to professions like my parents, who are psychologists, who need to, because Black people have to live. They've just got to get up in the morning and get out. We were having an argument, and I was explaining to my dad Afropessimism. He'd been reading Lacan and different things, and he says to me, if I was to believe that Alice in Wonderland, that loopy Alice in Wonderland logic of yours, you're seen in Minneapolis, Minnesota, because I have no choice but to go to Washington, D.C. and shoot every white person in sight. I said, well, you're being extremely hyperbolic. He said, how is that hyperbolic? I said, well, you wouldn't have to go all the way to Washington. So, he didn't. Thank you, Don, for laughing, because he didn't actually laugh at that joke, and I thought it was one of my better ones. But what was happening there is I was asking for a conversation about the ethical right of the place that we live to exist. And he was demanding that the scale of abstraction be lowered to what can we do to survive day to day. And the problem with his insistence is that he felt threatened by the conversation, that I was saying, get up your ass and get a gun and do something. I wasn't actually saying that. But what I would say is that in the therapeutic moment, I think there has to be a space where the Black adolescent or the Black patient is made aware that this is cyclical. When it is time for them to reinstantiate the big whammy of mass murder, the big whammy of aggression, they will do it. That where we are is the problem, not how we exist is the problem. Certainly I want a Black woman on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is doing horrible things, but the Supreme Court has no legitimacy as an institution. And that has to actually be re-articulated. I mean, it's a kind of knowledge that has to be passed down from generation to generation. Otherwise, we start to see ourselves as citizens and as humans, and then something happens, like 1800 to 1830, where 1 million Black people between the ages of 15 and 25 are reinterned and sent from the Eastern Seaboard into the worst form of slavery that they had ever known, into Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, where something like 1980 to 1990 happens, where 1 million Black people in the ages of 15 and 25 are suddenly thrown into prison, and we jump up. We have to understand that chattel slavery still exists, and social death is the rubric under which we live. And we might be lucky enough to live in an era where there's more mobility, but damn, at any moment in time, that can change, not because of what we decide.
Thank you, Frank. And it is 11:29. I think we need to be dialoguing about this forever. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for letting us be witnesses. Thank you, Dawn, for your fantastic questions. Thank you to the audience for their chats and questions. Apologies for not getting to them all, but I hope the richness of the dialogue was it in and of itself. This will be put on our website. Oh, am I back? Am I back?
Dawn, if you had any, yeah.
Oh.
Could I ask Miriam?
Yes.
I just want to hear, Dawn, if you had any parting words at all, anything.
I'm full of lots of emotion right now, to be honest, mixed emotions. And to prepare for this, I had already started watching some of the YouTubes available around Afropessimism, and some notes to process and lots of things to look at in history. But my parting words is that there's a shift that has occurred, and what I am understanding about my sense of being and place in this world, and how this collective conscious is constructed, and what purpose it serves. So I don't feel like I have a whole lot of coherent. This is mixed with some thinking and some emotions, lots of emotions.
I do understand. Thank you so much.
And again, thank you to you both. The recording will be available on the website next week. And for everyone that has registered, it will automatically be sent to them. So perhaps a couple more viewings, and we can all interrogate ourselves about this. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.